So we want to talk about the Silk Road here. The Silk Road, most people have heard it. The first thing you need to know is the Silk Road was not a road. The Silk Road was a whole network of routes that traveled from China, almost all the way to the Yellow Sea, in fact, across China, across Central Asia, into all the way to the Mediterranean Sea, and actually linked up Rome, the Roman Empire, with China and everything in between. There was a period of time in the Roman Empire when the most fashionable and luxurious thing available to any Roman woman was to wear silk. And there was only one place you could get silk, and that was from China, because the Chinese they were very clearly protective of the ability of the technology to make silk. In fact, the Romans, one Roman historian wrote that silk was made from a film that they peeled off of trees, because they didn't know about silkworms, and the Chinese kept that very tight. It wasn't until later when someone sneaked some silkworms into Central Asia from in a bamboo pole that they were able to start growing silkworms and producing silk in other places. And of course, it's produced around the world now. But the Silk Road network began, as I say, almost all the way to the Yellow Sea, the East China Sea, and carried up through across China. This is called the Hexe Corridor, or the Gansu Corridor, and I'll talk about that a little bit. Up around the Taklamakan Desert, also it's called the Tyron Basin. It's a very desolate desert right in this area of what is now Western China. And then over into the areas of Central Asia, all the way down into India, across to the Mediterranean Sea, particularly Byzantium or Constantinople, as it became a little bit later on. The primary period of time for this, the greatest period of time for the Silk Road, was during the Han Chinese Dynasty, which was roughly 200 BC to 280, about a 400-year period. But it continued to be active until the 1400s. There is a significant effort going on now to kind of revive the Silk Road trade for all sorts of reasons. They talk about the Silk Road coming into its own again. But the countries that it crossed in here, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, lots of the stands were involved in this, in addition, of course, to China, and then the countries carrying over to the Mediterranean Sea. The Silk Road was important not just for the trade of merchandise. From China, they did, it's called the Silk Road because silk was a primary product, but they also delivered ceramics, various other kinds of products from China, the spices from China and India. There was jade from China. There was all sorts of other precious stones. There was a huge traffic, as well as in horses, which is one of the things that China most wanted, were horses. We'll discuss that a little bit. But in addition to the merchandise movement, which is what most people think of, it was a huge channel for the transfer of all sorts of other things, including philosophy and ideas, religion. Buddhism came from India to China via the Silk Road. Islam, eventually, in the 5th century AD, was the Silk Road kind of routes that Islamic traders carried this information about their new religion. Technology, gunpowder, paper making, movable type, all sorts of technology transferred. The various other kinds of cultural ideas. And even, interestingly enough, disease. A lot of people don't realize that the Black Death, which was, sometimes people call it the bubonic plague, it was more than just the bubonic plague. There's 3 different kinds of plagues that were all part of the Black Death. But the Black Death began either in China or in Mongolia. And we're not exactly sure because it occurred there almost simultaneously. And it was because of the movement of traffic along the Silk Road, especially because eventually the Silk Road became not just land-based travel, but also there were ocean routes as well, as you can see here, and I'll show you that a little bit more. Ships carried, that were traveling from the east to Europe, carried the rats that had fleas that carried the Black Death, and so the Black Death, especially in the 15th century, was primarily introduced into Western Europe by ships that had come via the Silk Road routes. And of course, 1/3 of the population of Europe was killed by the Black Death. And so the Silk Road is involved, it's been called the most important historical development in the history of humankind by some historians. Give you some idea of the significance of all this. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the countries that were involved, or the empires I should say. This is how most of the traffic moved up until later on the development of the sea trade. The reason they developed sea trade as well as the camel caravans is the camel caravans were very efficient. They could carry like 1,000 pounds per camel. There were times in which caravans could have as many as 10,000 camels in them. There was a whole network of villages and cities and caravanseries. A caravansery was a stopover place for these caravans of camels, where they could rest, get refueled, feed the camels, and a lot of trading happened there as well. Very seldom did the product move from China to, let's say, Constantinople all the way in one caravan. There would be trading centers along the way where things were exchanged and then continued in sort of a relay effect. But the camels, as many of them as there were, they could travel 25 kilometers on a bad day, 50 kilometers on a good day, and so the various villages and caravanseries were spaced so that they would have someplace to stop and refuel and rest. But then they started transporting ceramics, and even from time to time they would have ore of certain types, things that were quite heavy, and in the case of ceramics, of course, very fragile. And that was why they really began to do a lot more trade all the way from China, the coastal areas over here, and around through Malaysia, around the into the Indian Ocean, using ships. Because they could move more, they could move heavier items, and it was not as fragile as bumping along all day long on the back of a camel. So there was a lot of different activity that led to the full development of both land and sea in terms of the caravans of the Silk Road. You'll notice, by the way, that these are Bactrian camels. You know the difference? The two-humped camels are Bactrian camels. The one-humped camels are Arabian camels. So that's the difference. And these were almost always Bactrian camels because, of course, Bactria is here in Central Asia, and that was the original source of those. This chart gives you an idea of sort of a timeline starting from around 400 BC, and I said this before, BCE, as you see right here, means before the Common Era, and CE means Common Era. That has been introduced because when you're talking about a country that Christianity is not the predominant religion, of course, to call it, BC, before Christ, and AD, which literally means Anno Domini, the year of our Lord, didn't make a whole lot of sense. And so from a scholarly point of view, they now talk about BCE and CE. I still use BC and AD because people get confused. It's difficult to explain to people who have not been introduced to that. But you'll notice the Roman Empire here from right around 200 BC to just after 400 CE. Now this is the Western Roman Empire centered in Rome. The Byzantine Empire in Constantinople was still the Roman Empire. It continued much longer. But the Roman Empire was just about the same period of time, at least early on, as the Han Dynasty down here at the bottom, if you can see that. The Han Chinese Dynasty, which is the dynasty that really was responsible for developing the Silk Road. But a couple of others I want to mention. Xiongnu, a word you may not be familiar with, Xiongnu. They were one of the most important, historically, of the northern nomadic peoples. And I'll talk about that a little bit. Also the Kushans, which earlier had been called the Weizi. You're going to understand those words in just a few minutes. But if you follow along down here in East Asia, you get the Sui dynasty, the Tang dynasty, the Song dynasty, and then the Mongols, or Yuan dynasty, and then the Ming dynasty. All of these are included here. But of particular importance is this period from 200 BC to 200 CE, or from BC to AD, where the Roman Empire, the Kushan, the Xiongnu, the Han dynasty, the Sakas, which were also called the Scythians. You may have heard the word Scythian. Those were all primary groups or empires during that period of time. To understand that, you need to, this is a map, obviously this is China, India, Arabia, You will notice geographically, you've got the highlands, which is the Tibetan plateau. Here, I mean, we're right up here. There is a line which has been drawn sort of right along here where I'm pointing. The line that separated the northern nomadic peoples, who were almost entirely nomadic herdsmen. They were great horse people. Their horses were powerful, fast. The warring tribes of the north were all horse warriors. They also raised cattle in great numbers, so they were a herding people. They would move from place to place dependent upon the weather, the availability of feeding grounds, etc. But south of that line, the people were almost all established agrarian people. They were settled. They didn't move from place to place. Much of the history of Asia is based upon the interaction between this northern nomadic herds people and the southern agrarian people, because each of those people had something they lacked and something that they were rich in. The agrarian people in the south were rich in crops, in industry, things like ceramics or metalwork or things like that. It's very hard to have metalwork if you're a nomadic people, because having everything that's necessary to melt iron and whatnot is very difficult if you're moving from place to place. So all of that was available from the agrarian south. But the agrarian south had a problem in that they did not grow as many animals. They didn't have as many animals. And so they were always wanting to purchase cattle. And specifically, the Chinese down here, the Chinese empires, the Han Dynasty particularly in this case, were very desirous of horses. In China, the horses that they raised were not very strong. In fact, they were not strong enough to carry a warrior in battle gear. They would sometimes use 3 or 4 horses on a chariot to pull a chariot, but apparently it was lack of potassium and other minerals in the grass that grew in China. The animals simply did not grow as strong. Whereas in the north, the animals were very strong and very hardy. They were used to more rugged weather. The grasslands in the north were much more conducive to growing healthy animals. And so the Chinese were always wanting to get horses and cattle as well from the north, and various other products like hides and whatnot. In the south, they provided various crops and manufactured goods. There was always a need for these two groups of people to interact with one another in trading. And when they couldn't successfully trade, then in the north at least, they would raid. Here you have, this is the Han Dynasty emperor, and this is a mounted Xiongnu nomad warrior. The Xiongnu were one of the largest of all of the tribal peoples. Another significant group was called the Weizi, and I'm going to talk about that. But this is what Han China faced. They didn't have horses strong enough to have these bow and arrow warriors riding in mass in these large groups of, when we say large groups, the Weizi at their height had almost 200,000 mounted warriors, primarily bow and arrow, but they also used lances and swords and other things. So very, very powerful military in that regard. We're starting to lean here. That's not just me, right?
No.
Okay. This map gives you some idea that Han Dynasty China is down here. The Xiongnu were a large nomadic and military force, and the Weizi, further a little bit to the west, you get the Kushan. The Weizi for a long time had been the most powerful of the nomadic groups, and in fact they regularly whipped up on both the Xiongnu. The Xiongnu actually had a larger population, but they were broken up into a lot of small tribes, and so therefore they didn't have the combined strength of the 200,000 mounted warriors of the Weizi. The Weizi would regularly would attack the Kushan. They would take slaves, they would take land away from them, they eventually killed their king, and so the Weizi were a major military power. There was at that point, one of the leaders of the Xiongnu, in order to try to, supposedly to make peace with the Weizi, gave his oldest son as a hostage. This is something they used to do in ancient times. the sons of the leaders would go and live with the enemy as sort of a guarantee that they were not going to have violence, because if they did attack, then they would kill the hostages, right? Well, in this case, the leader of the sort of smaller leader of the Xiongnu, of just some of the tribes, his name was Tuan. He had given his son, whose name was Modu, as a captive to the king of the Weizi. Well, short time after he gave his son as a captive, Tuman attacked the Weizi. The idea being, he didn't like his son. He didn't care if he killed him. Well, his son happened to be a pretty tough character, Modu. And Modu, when his father's forces attacked the Weizi, he stole a horse and got away and went back home, killed his father, and took over. Well, not only did he take over, but, and his name, this is him, this is a photograph of him later in life. Changyu Modu was his name. Changyu means chief. Sometimes you'll see it as Modu Changyu. But the Modu succeeded in getting all of the disparate Xiongnu tribes to join together. And he proceeded then to attack the Weizi. The first, and there were a series of wars here. The first one was kind of a draw. The Xiongnu didn't win, but the Weizi were kind of shocked that they had, all gotten together and were fighting back. Subsequently, the Xiongnu ended up defeating the Weizi and driving them to the west. In fact, Modu's son, Lao Shang, ended up killing the king of the Weizi and turning his skull into a drinking cup, which was apparently the thing to do when you conquered a people back in those days, if you're one of these nomadic tribes. So the Xiongnu created an empire by Changyu Modu getting all the Xiongnu tribes together to fight. They drove the Wusun east, or west, excuse me, and the Weizi west, and some of them south. The Weizi actually, after being beaten by the Xiongnu, they split in two. There were the greater Weizi and the lesser Weizi. The lesser Weizi moved south. The largest part of them, the greater Weizi, moved to the west. Now, what does all that matter? Here's where it gets interesting. Because the Xiongnu were so powerful, the Han Dynasty did a lot of work on the northern barrier walls, connecting bits and pieces of walls that existed before. It was under the Han Dynasty that the wall became fairly continuous, because they had connected the pieces, and became close to what we think of as the Great Wall of China today. Previously it had been broken up. And they did so in 142 when the Xiongnu tried to attack. They had very little success. They crossed here, but for the most part they were resistant. So the Xiongnu attack there was not very much. But 35 years later, when they attacked, when they had all their act together, they had massive efforts, and they crossed the Great Wall and were successful in attacking Han China. They were in fact, at one point, they defeated the armies of Han China and forced Han China to agree that they were now partners, whereas previously Han China considered themselves so far superior to any of these nomadic tribes. Well, this was a huge problem for Han China. It was a huge embarrassment to them that they were having to take what they consider these horrific northern tribespeople and admitting that they were their equals in partnership. And by the way, the Xiongnu, it's believed by some, and there is an agreement on this, but some people believe that the Xiongnu later on became the Huns. Actually, the title Xiongnu is a Chinese name. The original Mongolian name for them would have been the Hunan. And the Hunan, they believe, may have been the source of the name Han. Some scholars believe that out of Mongolia, the Xiongnu ended up becoming the Hunnic tribes that not only moved all the way down into India and Persia, but even into Eastern Europe. And it's because of the Huns that we get the name of Hungaria, because they settled into Eastern Europe. They believe that may be the same people. Now again, not all scholars agree on that, but it's believed that that may be what happened to them, and that Attila the Hun, therefore, was a descendant of the original Xiongnu leaders. Okay? The Weizi, they had been chased west by the Xiongnu. And so as they moved west, they ended up taking land away from the Wusun, and then eventually they defeated the Sogdians, which were major people at that time, and also the Scythians, also called the Sakai. They traveled, and as they went west, they began to move also south, down through Bactria, which again is Central Asia, and then all the way down into India. They ended up creating, the largest of the tribes of the Wezi people were called the Kushanis. And so they developed an empire called the Kushan Empire, or even the Great Kushan Empire. The Great Kushan Empire became very important because from northern China up into this Central Asia, they were a major participant in the Silk Road, in all of the trade that was going on in this part of the world after the Silk Road opened. They controlled a lot of it. They also were the ones that were responsible for bringing Buddhism from India after they got down here, and it coming over and into China, and then eventually to Korea and Japan. So they were a major cultural force as well, the Kushan Empire. I know you probably have not heard of Xiongnus and Wezis and Kushans, but these were very important people historically in the history, not only of Asia, but because of their involvement in the Silk Road, really of the development of much of what happened in Western culture as well. So the Han Chinese are very embarrassed by the fact that the Xiongnu are declaring themselves equal partners. And they want to find a way to fight back. And they said, well, you remember back when that other tribe, the Wezi, were here and how powerful they were? If we joined forces with them, maybe together, the Han Chinese Dynasty and the Wezi could defeat the Xiongnu. So they decided to go looking for the Wezi, since they'd left. They had gone to the west. And in order to find them, the emperor of the Han Dynasty appointed a special envoy, an ambassador. His name was Jiang Shen. Jiang Shen. Jiang Shen is, to this day, a major national hero in China. You will find statues to him in various places. Because what happened was, he was sent out from the capital of the Han Empire at that point was Chang'an. He went to the west looking for the Wezi to try to convince them to come back and fight with Han against their mutual enemy, the Xiongnu. Well, he did meet up with some of the leaders of the Kushans at this point because they changed their name. The largest tribe of the Greater Wei, they had taken their name as the empire, but they didn't want to come back. They said, we're doing fine where we are. We don't want to go back just for the sake of having a war against somebody who defeated us previously. So he traveled, and you'll notice this up here, the Longchang. That was the capital of the Xiongnu Empire. Along the way, he got captured. Jiang Chen got captured by the Xiongnu, taken to their capital, and was held there for 10 years. Now, he was held under pretty good circumstances. He was treated, very well. He married while he was there in that 10 years and had children. After 10 years, he said, I wonder what's happening back home. And so he, after having traveled well over past the Pamir Mountains, over into this area of Fergana, he ended up coming back after 10 years to the Han Empire. He made a shorter trip again later on. He was the first person to bring back reliable reports to the Han Chinese Empire about what lay beyond their western area, which was considered sort of no man's land. This is the Tyron Basin, which I mentioned to you is the site of the Taklamakan Desert. And I'll show you more maps of that in a minute. But I have to mention this Fergana up here, this Fergana Valley south of Lake Balkhash. The Chinese wanted horses. They wanted strong horses. Well, they came to find out, because of this trip and some other things, that in Fergana, they bred and raised the most powerful horses anywhere. The Chinese were convinced that these horses were sired by dragons. Wow. They were called the heavenly horses of Fergana, or the horses that sweat blood. Because, and they were not sure why, but either because they had a parasite that would cause their sweat to look red, or because they had very thin skin, and when they exerted themselves, they would have sort of blood seepage. It looked like they sweated blood. So these were the heavenly horses that sweated blood. And they were the Han Chinese twice sent armies to try to capture some of these horses. And both those armies ended up being destroyed. They ended up very few of these horses coming along, but they were a huge desire of the Han Empire. And the Han wanted them not only for military reasons, because they wanted to be able to compete with the nomadic soldiers, the horse soldiers of the north, but also for ceremonial purposes. That these powerful, strong, beautiful horses could be used in the ceremonies in which the emperor was honored and all of that. Well, so Jiang Chen, after being gone for 10 years, comes back with reports. He not only had found several new empires, several new peoples, but he had seen evidence and heard great stories about a major empire that was further to the west, which was the Roman Empire. They didn't call it that, they had a Chinese name for it, but the Roman Empire. This was the first time the Chinese had any indication of anything that was further to the west than the Gobi Desert. So Jiang Chen became a huge hero in China. He also, the record of his exploits came, and he was, as you can see from the dates down here, in the 2nd century BC. Well, in the 1st century BC, there is the Annals of the Great Historian by Sima Qiang, no relationship. Sima Qiang, the Annals of the Great Historian, is one of the most important books written in Chinese history. It is goes back to the very start. It's one of the sources that identifies the earliest dynasty as being the Xia dynasty, and then talks about the travels of Jiang Chen as well. So at that point, the emperor, even though he didn't get the Wei Zi to come back and fight for him, he decided that we need to start exploiting this opportunity with these new countries we found out about in the West. One of the things they did was they created a standardized sort of route that would get them there. Now, and I'll show you. This is why they had to have only certain routes. This is what the land looks like. It's either really high mountains, you've got the Tibetan Plateau to the south, but much of it looks like this. And so there was, even though it wasn't just one road, there were very limited number of routes that they could take that would get them to the west. Well, one of the most important areas was called the Hexi Corridor, or the Guangzhou Corridor, and it ended up being a string of villages, or actually I shouldn't say villages, they were actually fortresses and towns that built up around them, that were along the Great Wall. This area right down here is the same as that. Each of these were passes. When they say pass, in the case of the Great Wall, the pass means it was a fortress through which they had, you could travel. And the Great Wall at that point was being used for defense, but it also was a place where they could control immigration, people coming in and out. They could control trade, because even though they were fighting with people in the north, they still had trade with them because they needed the cattle and whatnot. And it also became a major transportation route. So what happened was they created the Guangzhou Corridor, or Hexi Corridor, that would come up here to Dunhuang. At Dunhuang, it's split in 3 options. One of them, it would go north, the northern route that went over to the Black Sea eventually. And then it split and went both south and north of the Taklamakan Desert. Again, that's also called the Tyron Basin. And along the way, these were all became caravanseries. They became trading areas where people would bring their products, they would trade them, they would rest their camels, and move on from there. But the Great Wall, again, was right along here, and it was specifically extended and designed to protect this route, which was the eastern end of the route of the Great Silk Road, all right? And that's why they had to do that. This is what the Silk Road became eventually. Again, from Chang'an, which was the capital, they then later developed routes that went down to the southern, to traffic down to Malaysia. They had routes by sea, which went to India, as well as, again, the Tyron Basin, the Taklamakan Desert here, and the northern route. Went all the way over to Byzantium, traveled through Iran and over to Antioch on the Mediterranean, down into the Saudi Arabian Peninsula. And this map down here gives you an idea. The ceramics, silk, gold and silver, jewels, spices, the kinds of things they traded. And then from the west, they got wine. Wine was introduced because the Romans had developed wine, actually originally the Etruscans and some of the people in Asia Minor, but also other kinds of glassware and other things that were produced, even non-silk fabrics, which the Chinese found useful. So this was the kind of traffic that they had. This gives you an idea of the modern day countries that were part of the Silk Road trade. Of course, you get China here, Tibet, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Afghanistan, India down here, Turkmenistan, Persia, now Iran, Iraq, Syria, Turkey, the Caucasus, and then over into Greece, Constantinople. I mentioned to you that the Black Death was carried through the Silk Road. In particular, when the Mongols come along, I'm going to talk about them in just a minute, they were attacking the city of Kaffa, which is on the Black Sea up here. And Kaffa is a fortified city. It's open to the sea so that they could get boats in and out, but from the land side, it's entirely surrounded by a wall. Well, the Mongolian army, under I think it was Hulagu Khan, were attacking, and while they were besieging the city from the landward side, the plague struck them, and so they were having a lot of people dying. Well, they decided it's not fair that we get all of the pleasure of having the plague in our midst. Why don't we share this with the people in the city? So they started using catapults to throw bodies over the wall, and bodies of people who had died from the plague. And so it's the first example of germ warfare in history, you know. So the people in the city contracted the disease. Well, some of the people, out of fear, in particular Venetian sailors, jumped on board their ships because they could still access the water from here, and they took off. And that was the first major introduction. When those ships landed in Italy and other places, and they traveled around, the places where those ships landed was where the Black Plague first took hold in Europe. And then later on in the 1400s, that was in the 1200s, in the 1400s was a worse epidemic, again, brought from Asia via the sea routes of the Silk Road. In the 13th century, again the 1200s, we have the rise of the Mongols. Again, the tribes, the Xiongnu, Weizi, they were of Mongolian descent, at least partially, but the Mongols in this case, we're talking about Genghis Khan, or to be more accurate in the pronunciation, Chenghis Khan. You remember, pronunciations have all changed because of the use of a different transliteration. Chenghis Khan is now considered a more appropriate way to translate his name. But they were some of the most fearsome mounted bow and arrow warriors ever. This is what the Mongolian Empire looked like at its height, when it was at its greatest extent. In fact, the Mongolian Empire is the largest contiguous land empire in history. The only empire that's been bigger than it is the British Empire, but it was in a lot of different places. Australia, India, etc. Whereas the Mongolian Empire stretched from Eastern Europe all the way to Northern Korea, the Japanese Sea here, all the way from southern Siberia down through to the Indian Ocean. Massive, and they accomplished this in record time. Less than 100 years, Genghis Khan, his sons, and his grandsons were responsible for all of this. And these are the guys. Genghis Khan's true name was Temujin. Genghis Khan means universal leader. In 1206, Temujin started out as a young boy. His father was kind of a minor lord amongst the Mongolian tribes, and his father was killed by an enemy. He was orphaned and then deserted. And because he had to scrape by and just survive, he became very tough. Eventually, he worked his way up, fighting, defeating people, until finally in 1206, the Mongol tribes, in a gathering of leadership, declared him to be the universal leader, the Chenghis Khan. Khan meaning leader. And so he began this campaign. He believed that he was called upon by the Mongolian gods, the deities of the Mongolians, to and he had a vision of this, to put all of humanity under his sword, meaning that he would control all of them. His sons, he had 4 sons. They are Yoki, Chagatai, Ogadai, and Tolui. Tolui had 2 sons, Hulegu Khan and Kublai Khan, probably the second most famous of the Khans. Kublai Khan ended up later on being the great Khan who was the emperor of China. He created the Han Dynasty. It was the third from the last dynasty. It was the Han, and then the Ming, and then the Qing. But the Han Dynasty under Kublai Khan was one of the most powerful and important of all of the Chinese dynasties. So they controlled all of this area between Genghis Khan, his sons, and his grandsons. And this is what it was like. This is how they ended up conquering a huge amount of territory in a very short period of time because of their power as these mounted. They used a special kind of bow they invented, which was a composite bow made of bone and leather and wood glued together. They developed a recurve bow. You'll see here, you know, it curves back on itself like that, which gave it much more power. They could shoot further with more power and more accuracy than anybody before them, and they could do it riding full tilt on the back of a horse. So they ended up being the conquerors of pretty much the whole known world at that point. The only reason they ended up stopping, several times they ended up stopping, when the Khan, or the leader that was responsible, one of the sons or grandsons, would die, they would all go back, the leaders would all go back in order to elect a new great Khan. And the final efforts of Hulegu Khan, the only thing that stopped them from continuing to progress into Europe and into North Africa was the fact that the great Khan died, and he went back to help participate in the electing of a new Khan, which was Kublai Khan after that. But this was the power that they exerted. They also were quite extraordinary technologically. They were able to adopt and adapt various kinds of technology, including the use of siege engines. They were very successful in attacking fortified cities because as they went along, they learned from everybody they conquered. And so they developed catapults and rams and various other kinds of siege engines that allowed them to conquer these cities. They also would take their houses with them. You'll notice that this is a dozen oxen pulling a yurt, as it would be called, because these yurts were mounted on platforms, and they would just put enough oxen in front of them and they could just move their whole houses. And this is the way as they traveled, because they were used to being a very mobile people, and they continued that, how they were able to move so quickly. The stories are consistent that people were shocked at how quickly they were attacked by the various Mongol tribes. They would hear that the Mongols were, 200 miles away, and before they could blink, the Mongols were here, because they moved so quickly, and they, being a very mobile people. Eventually, after the death of Genghis Khan, his sons and then grandsons ended up taking over as being in charge, and by the death of the last of the great Khans, who was Kublai Khan, the emperor of the Chinese Han Dynasty, this is in 1294, there were 4 major divisions of the Mongol Empire. In the north and up into Russia, there was the Khanate of the Golden Horde. The Golden Horde was led by Yoki, the oldest son, and 2 of his sons. And they actually had the Blue Horde and the White Horde as part of the Golden Horde. And then the Ilkhanate, which literally means the subordinate Khanate, because Tolui, one of his sons, who led that group, he was not interested in being the great Khan, and he said, I'm fine with being subordinate to whoever else gets elected great Khan. So there was the Ilkhanate, which was down in Persia and into northern India. There was the Chagatai Khanate. One of his sons, Genghis Khan's son, was Chagatai, and so he had the Khanate here, which was part of Persia and Central Asia. And then the Khanate of the Great Khan, which was Kublai Khan. He was named Great Khan. He was the 5th of the Great Khans, and he had been the head of the empire in China. After the Han Dynasty was defeated by the Mings, they retreated up into Mongolia, back to their old homeland, and They continue to try to threaten China, and they continue to call themselves the Northern Han Dynasty, and felt like they had a right to try to retake the property in China, but they were never successful in doing that. So extraordinary the extent to which they were successful in conquering. So this is the Silk Road. Extraordinary. What was historically significant about this, again, not just merchandise, but ideas, philosophy, culture, language, religion, technology, all of that traveled in both directions, from China and the countries of the West Asia and Central Asia, all the way over into the Mediterranean. What the world, the Western world or the Eastern world, would not be what it is today were it not for this. Again, it's been called the greatest accomplishment in the history of human culture. And so from this, we have so many of the things that we appreciate and understand today. I'm going to put that up there, and we'll talk about it in a minute. Questions about Silk Road, any of that? Yes?
If you think of China's GDP at that time, is there any estimate of how much of that was driven by the trade on the Silk Road? Was it a little tiny piece of their economy?
So what percentage of the economy of China would have been represented by the Silk Road trade? Probably in terms of total cash value, not that much, because most of what they were bringing in would have been considered luxuries. The emperor, the emperor's family, the aristocrats, they were the ones primarily benefiting from it. Common people, I mean, China was still almost entirely agrarian at that point, except for the cities, Chang'an and others. But most of what they were importing, Roman glass, jewels from various places, spices from India, they were not the sort of things that common people in the 1200s, well, back in the Han Dynasty, in the 200 BC to 200 AD, that most of the people would be interested in. But the people who had the money and the people who had the power were very interested in that. Just like the common laborers in Rome were not interested in Chinese silk, but the Roman women of wealth, the wives of senators, etc., they wouldn't be seen in anything else. It was critically important to them. It was the Gucci of their day. And so, yeah, it was just the highest level, but that still was very important in terms of because they wanted these things, the trade happened back and forth. And as I say, merchandise wasn't really the most important part of it. It was all of the culture and technology and everything that went with it. George?
Do you know what historian first coined this phrase, the Silk Road?
Yes, I do.
Didn't call it the Black Death Road or the Nomads Road. There's a lot of romance just in the nomenclature.
Yes. And that's it. The title itself gave it a kind of romance, even though there's a lot more going on than just silk. The title of the Silk Road came not till the 19th century. And it was a German geographer. He was an expert on Chinese and all of Asian, actually, geography. His name was Ferdinand von Richthofen. Ferdinand von Richthofen was the uncle of Baron von Richthofen, who was the German World War I ace. But he was one of the premier scholars of particularly geography, but other aspects of Chinese and Asian culture at that time. And he was the first one in his writings in German who gave it the name, the Silk Road. But yeah, and again, if you called it the Black Death Road or something else, it probably would not be nearly as much fun to talk about. Back in the back. How does Marco Polo fit into all of this? Well, some people think Marco Polo was the first one to make it to Asia. He wasn't. He was the first one who, after he got back to Europe and was in jail, he started telling these stories to a guy who was in jail with him, and his jailmate ended up writing them all down, and so you get the stories of Marco Polo's travels. Marco Polo actually did not make this journey until the time of Kublai Khan, until he visited the Great Khan in China. Now this wasn't until the 1200s, 1200s AD. Remember, the Silk Road started in the 2nd century BC. And then carried over. So there were a lot of people going back and forth between that time, mostly merchants, but there were some diplomats who were coming along, relationships were being built between China and other countries. So, but Marco Polo was the first one that really, in Europe, got the stories of his experience with the Kublai Khan, the great court, the Kublai Khan, published, so that Europeans began to be able to read about and learn about what was going on there. Because prior to that, it had been either purely diplomats or it had been merchants who were aware of a lot of that stuff. Okay? Other questions? Yes?
What were conditions like for those who travelled those routes? I mean, how safe was it for them, and were there any governances on those routes?
Okay, so how safe was it for the travel? Was there any governance, any control over that area? Well, the level of safety depended upon where you were. The threat from some of the northern raiders was why the Chinese extended the Great Wall up past Dongguan, the last of the villages before you get into the Taron Basin. The greatest danger would have been from just the natural, the Taron Basin, for instance. People went around it north or south because it's a horrendous desert, and not many people could survive it. There were places where after you got past the Taron Basin, you had to cross the mountains. There are a series of mountains: the Pamir Mountains, the Hindu Kush in Afghanistan, the Tian Shan Mountains, and so even going through passes, you're talking about high elevation that people are having to cross over. So just the rigors of a journey like that with camels was the biggest danger. There was some danger of robbery, but again, this is one of the reasons why caravans would travel, with up to 10,000 camels. Going to take a pretty big raiding group to feel like that they can attack a large caravan like that, because a caravan of that size would be able to defend themselves because it'd have a lot of people involved. Plus, the caravansaries provided safety. When they would travel to the next sort of a oasis or caravansary which were set up especially to provide them some place for their animals to stay, provide food and drink for them, a safe place for them to stay. Not to say that nobody ever got killed or nobody ever got robbed. But as things went, it was probably as safe as anything else you could do in that part of the world at that time. Again, the natural dangers would be far greater than any danger of robbery or anything like that, because it was a regularly trafficked route.